So during his short run for the 2020 presidential candidacy for the Democratic Party, a guy by the name of Andrew Yang was fairly critical of GDP as a measure of a country's well-being. He actually said, traditionally, the economy has been measured by looking at the gross domestic product. However, even the creator of GDP admits that it doesn't really reflect the full story, and rising GDP has virtually no relationship with each citizen's well-being. And what he's really referring to here, this last part, the citizen's well-being, is something we refer to as the standard of living. Well, what exactly is that standard of living and how do we measure it? Well, standard of living is a level of wealth, comfort, material goods, and necessities that are available to a certain socioeconomic class or within a certain geographic region. So if we were to ask, what is the standard of living in the United States? What people typically do is they look to the GDP. And what Andrew Yang is saying here, he's like, listen, that's not really what the purpose of the GDP is. The GDP doesn't really measure the citizen's well-being. Now, GDP and citizen well-being does typically have a correlation, but GDP does not represent the well-being. But the Federal Reserve, which is the central bank of the United States, actually said that there's this generally accepted measure for standard of living, and it's GDP per capita. So even our central bank recognizes that we typically do use the GDP as this measure for standard of living, but more specifically, we use something known as the GDP per capita. GDP per capita is. In order to define GDP per capita, what we do is we just take a country's real GDP and we divide it by their population. And so therefore we take that entire GDP and we say, okay, but how much is that on average per person? Like if I was to ask you and say, okay, you have a factory that produces pencils. How many pencils did you produce today? You might say 100. I'm like, okay, well, is that good or is that bad? Well, if you tell me you have 1,000 workers and you only produced 100 pencils, that's not all that good. But if you produce 100 pencils with only 10 workers, hey, that's better. And so what we do is we have to look at it based on, how many workers or how many people do they have available in that country to create that much GDP. So all we do is we take our real GDP, we divide it by the population. So if we take a look at the United States, recently the United States had roughly a GDP of $19.2 trillion with a population of 329 million people. If we divide that out, we find out that the United States' GDP per capita was about $58,365. Now here's one thing we have to understand. That is not saying that the average income per person in the United States is $58,000. That is not what that means. It just means that if you were to take our total output of goods and services and divide that out by the number of people that are in our country, you'd get that we produce $58,365 worth of goods and services per person in our country. Now, the reason we typically look to this as a measure of standard of living is because, like I said, there is a correlation. And so examples. I'm actually going to ask you to plug these into a calculator as well. Let's take a look at Japan. What I did is I really rounded these numbers to make it a little bit easier. Japan has a GDP of about $5.1 trillion and a population of 126.5 million people. So what is their GDP per capita? Well, if you divide that out, you would find that their GDP per capita is about $40,316.21. Right? And so again, it's fairly comparable to that of the United States. And we know that. We know that the United States and Japan are both developed economies. But then let's look at a country like Uganda. Uganda has a GDP of $28.5 billion with a population of about 45 million people. If you divide that out, we end up with $633.33. So that's saying that the country of Uganda produces $633 worth of goods and services per person. And so again, like I said, this is why we typically see it used as a measure of standard of living, is because there is a correlation there between the two, but it does not directly represent like the income per person or anything like that.